Hello and welcome back to another We Are Sunderland video. We've only been on off a couple of hours and we're back again. Today I'm joined by Scott Wilson. He's come on to join me and Joe. Obviously we're on this morning. How are you both doing?
Is there something happening, like?
Must be.
Is there something going on to talk about?
It's never quiet.
What a day. No, what a day.
Yeah, so obviously for those of you who haven't seen the news, Sunderland and Michael Beale are set to part ways with one another. Comes after back-to-back defeats against Birmingham City and Huddersfield. Firstly, Joe, I mean, does it come as a surprise?
Yes and no. I think yes, in the sense that you felt as though it might have come straight after the game, especially with what happened, the sort of Trey Hume incident as well. If that was a factor with it, the fact that we've got into Monday suggests that you might have been able to see him getting into the weekend or maybe even looking towards the international break. After all, the club did hand Michael Beale the 2.5-year contract, so this is not a sort of a short-term thinking plan that they brought him in when replacing Tony Mowbray. But no, in the sense that it's just it's almost felt inevitable that it's going to be a struggle for him from the off, to be perfectly honest. I think after the first game against Coventry, when they were getting beat 3-0, it was a case of the supporters were kind of venting their frustrations at the decision and sort of showing their support for Tony Mowbray and that. And then it's just never really been able to get back from that, has it? Even despite a decent run over Christmas and into the new year, there was a little bit of a distraction with all of the derby noise and that FA Cup tie of Newcastle and everything that went on off the field. I think we spoke about this morning, didn't we, actually, Matty? That he got caught up in that probably unfairly, but then the performance and the result in that game is never going to lend yourself to warming any hearts, is it? So that then fed into a couple of defeats in the league as well, and what we saw against Hull, where fans really sort of vented the frustrations. And when you lose the crowd, it's really difficult to see that come back and pull that back. And he didn't just lose them, he lost them in a big way, didn't he? They really voiced their opinions at the end of that game. And then on social media throughout that weekend, with things trending from to leave the club, a little bit of a reprieve with the results, but then sort of certain press conferences and things like that, he probably didn't help himself in the way he came out and with words that he'd said in terms of hitting back a little bit of that criticism. So it's always felt as though he's kind of a week or two away from being back in the mire, if you will. And then obviously back-to-back defeats this week against teams that, if you want to get in the top 6, you've got to go and get results in. Their away form hasn't improved. The form in general hasn't improved. I think Beale's 12 games, I know there's one of them that is the FA Cup game, but I think they pretty much mirror Tony Mowbray's last 12 games. So if you're bringing him in to make a change and progress, we haven't seen that so far. And if Sunderland are serious about trying to get into the top 6, there's this sort of 13 games of the season left to go, and some really tough ones as well coming up next month. You're almost at a bit of a crossroads, aren't you? So from that point of view, no, I'm not surprised, but it's short, isn't it? 64 days, I think it is, 12 games.
Yeah, particularly, obviously, we've had a comment through here. Why no club statement? We are aware that there will be a club statement made in the coming few hours or so. Obviously, we don't know whether he's left the club off his own free will yet, whether he's resigned, or whether there's been discussions with the hierarchy and he's been sacked at this stage. Scott, he made comments a couple of weeks ago, a couple of press conferences ago, it might be a matter of days ago, about being in it for the long run. I mean, how it seems to have unravelled quite quickly, this one, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpick in all of this, isn't there? There's the why did it go wrong for Michael Beale angle to this, and then there's the where on earth does this leave Sunderland, and what questions does it ask about the decision making at the very top, and can the hierarchy be kind of trusted to get key decisions right? So let's start with Beale. Why did it go wrong for Beale? I think Joe's hit an awful lot of those nails on the head. I don't think we're speaking really with the benefit of the hindsight when we're saying it didn't feel right from the outset, because it didn't. It didn't feel like a particularly easy marriage, Beale and Sunderland. Now, partly that's not his fault, because there was no groundswell of really opinion to get rid of Tony Mowbray. There was then that lengthy period, kind of like we saw in the period before Alex Neil came in, where various names are getting bandied around, various options are there. You know, some of the overseas ones probably felt more appealing than Beale. So when it is Beale, straight away he's on the back foot. And then he's clearly not helped himself at various stages through his reign, both in terms of the way he set the side up and just the fact that he's made what was a really attractive side to watch under Tony Mowbray far less appealing on the eye and no more effective in terms of results. So that counts against him. And then, you know, the kind of litany of off-field issues that just kind of kept coming, didn't they? The Southern accent stuff, the kind of taking on the fans stuff, the tri-Hume handshake. And again, you know, some of them weren't his fault. The Hume thing almost certainly, you know, wasn't his fault, but it just added to this idea of everything going wrong. So that's the kind of where did it go wrong for Beale angle. The other angle, as I think we had a question on Speakman there, is where does this leave Speakman, Kirill Louis-Dreyfus, and the Sunderland hierarchy? Because they didn't have to get rid of Mowbray. They made that decision because they felt they knew best. And it's been 2 months of utter disaster. You know, it's hard to think how this could have gone more wrong, really. And so now you're left with the situation where fans quite rightly are going to be saying, can they be trusted to be the ones running this football club and getting the next decision right? And they're going to have to do some real hard work to win over the supporters on that, because understandably there's going to be an awful lot of doubts now.
Yeah, I mean, it's plenty of valid points. As you say, there's so much to dissect in this. And I think at Michael Beale's first press conference as well, Christian Speakman came out and said, sorry, he said that, no, I'm going to hold my hands up if this decision will fall on me. And now we're at that stage. Where do they go from here? What's next? Because I know Will Still was a name that was bandied about a bit before Michael Beale came in. If you weren't going to pay the money, for example, to get a Will Still out of his contract, I'm not saying that this has happened, I'm just speaking metaphorically. If that has happened and you've then had to sack Michael Beale, you've then spent money which you could have inadvertently spent elsewhere. As I say before, look, we don't know the ins and outs of this, but there's so many questions that arise from this. I think Beale, the stats are Beale's the shortest long-term managerial, shortest managerial appointment in the club's history. So that has to be, that's a real big admission of getting that wrong.
Yeah, so I'll tackle the question that's on the screen direct. I still think that Speakman and Kirill Louis-Dreyfus come as a package. I still think that Kirill Louis-Dreyfus is more than happy to have Speakman as his man on the ground, his key decision maker, his sporting director. Now, if you're Louis-Dreyfus, you've got to be looking at this and thinking, well, this is a major black mark in the column against him. You know, we put our faith in this appointment and it hasn't worked. I would still be surprised if that meant that Speakman's days were numbered, because I think they're that close together. So now, you know, will this result in a move away from the project, the model, whatever you want to call it? Will it make them rethink what they're doing in terms of their appointments, in terms of the way that they're running the club, in terms of so many of the key decisions that they've got wrong in the last few months? You would like to think so. You'd really hope so. But I would still be surprised if Speakman wasn't running the ship and kind of being in charge of what happens next, because everything that I've heard up to this point makes me think that his relationship with Kirill Louis-Dreyfus is still exceptionally close.
Yeah, sorry, Joe, go on.
I just think the main thing to take from that is that this is an acceptance of getting a decision wrong. This is, like, I think it's the fourth head coach / manager that's been in charge in 2 years. If you go back to sort of Lee Johnson getting sacked when, you know, they obviously made the decision that they didn't think they were going to get in the automatic promotion spots in League One that season. I think it's documented on the Netflix series, isn't it? You know, they had to make a decision. Alex Neil came in. He left for whatever reasons he left for. Tony Mowbray, he did exceptionally well last year. then he sort of found the same issues that Alex Neil was having. You could argue, sort of contested the policy or the structure of things. They turned to Michael Beale, who they think then is the answer, and it hasn't gone the way that they wanted. So, yeah, it's going to take a lot to sort of win supporters back over with this. And, you would expect that it's going to be Mike Dodds who would go into interim charge now. They've really got to get this appointment right. And also, you've got to look at the sort of the structure and just long term. Is it sustainable to keep cycling through managers and head coaches like that, even with the model of the head coach just being there to look after the players and the day-to-day of the team, and none of the above that? That there's a lot of things that they need to really address here, because there are plenty of questions and supporters rightly going to be frustrated about it.
Yeah, it's something we spoke about as well on the pod this morning. I mean, if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, there's arguably very little fresh that we could say from that. But the situation that the club finds itself in, as we said on the pod this morning, I'll reiterate it again here. You can't come out and say, look, promotion's the aim, top 2, blah, 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 and then continue on the run of form that they were on. What I find interesting is that Speakman said as well in his press conference was effectively we saw the downturn in form coming. Now, did they see that downturn in form when Beale was there? Did they allow him to have a couple of games where it went poorly, and then now we've that peak we saw before this weekend sort of run of games, the Huddersfield and the Birmingham game, has that tipped them over the edge? Did they think that the turn of games just gone, the 3 unbeaten was that enough? But another comment come through here from Joe. Speakman needs to be looked at, and finding a manager that'll work under a director of football is difficult. And I think that's another valid point, isn't it? Because as we've touched on there, you've had the past 3 or 4 managers. Michael Beale hasn't obviously officially left yet, but there's Tony Mowbray was critical of how things have worked in terms of bringing players in. The same with Alex Neil. It's difficult, as you say. Who in their right mind is going to want to come in, having seen that you're now all of a sudden 4 managers in 2 years? Yes, I get the point that Sunderland are still an up-and-coming quality team. They've got plenty of pedigree there, but you need to get this one right.
I think one of the things that I would say in response to that is it brings me back to one of the key questions that I felt was behind what happened to Tony Mowbray, and that is, what do Kirill Louis-Dreyfus and Christian Speakman want Sunderland to be? Do they want Sunderland to be a club that has a long-term plan based around the development of young players, about being financially sustainable, about growing the club, about being strategic in everything you do? Because that's the messaging that we're getting all the time, that's what they want Sunderland to be. Or do they want Sunderland to be a club that have to get promotion? Because at the minute, I feel like that they're veering between the two wildly. If your priority is to get Sunderland promoted, then by all means, hire and fire managers at the drop of a hat if you think if they're not doing that. But then back them when they're in place by putting together a squad that is being built to win promotion. At the minute, the messaging that I get is that we want a manager who's going to come in and get us promoted, but we want to build a squad that's going to be okay for the next 4 years and is going to make us money. Well, the two, for me, don't sit together at the minute in the way that they're trying to put them together. If you want to build a squad for the long term and prioritize constantly buying young players and developing and then improving them, then that's fine. But don't judge the head coach then on purely whether they're going to win promotion or not, because part of their job then has to be the nurturing and the development of those young players. And that's where I felt that getting rid of Mowbray jarred for me, because in that side of the job, he was doing everything right. Now, if your job is, if you're saying, no, we want a head coach to win us promotion, simple as that, fine. Don't get rid of Alex Pritchard. Don't get rid of Danny Barth. Don't get rid of players who could help you do it, because it doesn't fit the other part of what you're trying to do. That's for me the fundamental issue at Sunderland at the minute, that they're going in 2 different directions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, nail on the head there, Scott. It's something that we've said repeatedly on this, is that there are conflicting messages. I felt a notable point as well from Michael Beale was that we are a young team. We're not going to talk about how young we are. And then in the following, press comments that follow, it's been basically everyone, we are a young team. So which is it? Where's that message coming from? Is it a young team that needs developing, that needs time? Come out and say that. Don't say we're aiming for the top, because it's clear that these players aren't quite at the level that are going to do that yet.
That's the thing for me. I think you look at the contrasting records of the last 12 of Mowbray and the 12 under Beale. There isn't a great deal of difference, is there? Beale's maybe tinkered a little bit with tactics out of possession to try and make Sunderland a little bit harder to beat, but they're still conceding cheap goals. They're not as much as a threat. And then it goes back to kind of we spoke about this morning. Is the squad good enough? Has it been equipped enough to fulfill those sort of credentials and the aspirations what have been said? And at the minute, you'd have to say it wouldn't be. So where's the ambition? Where's the line in terms of getting the ambition of making that top two and competing for that top two, or very much building on what you did last season, or to what Scott's point was, just sort of bringing players in who have lots of potential, who can maybe make money further down the line? I mean, we spoke about Romain Mundle today, didn't we? He impressed on his first start. He's the sort of player that, what makes this model, if you will, a success. But is that sustainable to try and build a squad that's going to get promoted? The disparity between the Championship and the Premier League at the minute would say no, because the teams that are coming down, there's the financial clout that they've got, the quality of players that they've got, you're going to do well to try and break into that. Obviously, Ipswich have had a go at it this year, and then they've gone again in January to try and break into it, knowing that if they don't, then they're probably going to find themselves possibly in a similar situation as what Sunderland are next season. And Sunderland now, they're running the risk almost of you then get lost a little bit in that chasing pack. There's always sort of 6, 7, 8 teams that are in and around for large parts of the season, and then there'll be a couple that just drift off. And if you get stuck in there, then what's your next move? Now it feels as though what is going on with the head coach? Who do they turn to? What do they turn to? Is it somebody in a foreign market, like you said before, with someone like Will Still coming in? Do they try and bring someone else in who knows this league? There's just so many things for them to consider with this.
The only thing I would jump in and say on the back of this is that while it does feel utterly chaotic and it's a farcical 2 months, really, I think it's probably the right call to admit defeat early now and make the change, because it's felt from the word go, really, that you're only one defeat, one bad performance, one misstep away from another crisis. And you can't have a club where week after week after week, the pressure's piling on the manager, the fans aren't happy, the results aren't there. It wasn't going to be sustainable for very much longer. So if that's the case, you might as well make the decision now. So for all that it feels utterly chaotic, and it is, I still think it's probably the right call to admit defeat early on in this and say, hold your hands up and say we've got this wrong, because they have. Clearly, then it's what happens next, and that's what we need to see, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. It's where do they go from here? Because do you inadvertently write the season off? I think, obviously, as we've said, Mike Dodds is someone who will come in for the next couple of games. Glenn seems to think that that'll be Mike Dodds until the end of the season. I thought they could have went that way prior to Michael Beale coming through the door, just given, Dodds' run of form when he was in that hot seat. What do you think, Joe?
No, I totally agree. It's no secret that obviously the squad felt very close to Tony Mowbray. He was sort of seen as that father figure, wasn't he? So then disrupting that and then bringing somebody else in was always likely to open itself up to possibly not work, and particularly when results didn't pick up either. But it's not just that. I think you can go, and I agree with Scott in terms of saying that it probably is the right call and it's the right decision to make it now rather than probably throw the season away. At least you may be looking at doing something. But the way the games have gone, like in attacking sense, I think the 7 in the 12 games, like the XG's been lower than 1. It's been laboured, hasn't it? So that's not. Is it getting the most out of sort of the flair players that Sunderland have got? Outside of Jack Clark, we've spoke about that every other week. If it's not hit through him, then what happens? One thing you would say about Michael Beale is, though, he did get some goals from the forward lines. 2 from Roos and so far, 1 from Burstow, but at what expense? And then there's been no continuity in the selections of keeping one of them up front either. It's been chopping and changing. So how much of that is on the head coach? That was on Tony Mowbray before. It's been on Michael Beale now. Or how much does that go back again to above there and the recruitment in the summer?
Interestingly, Scott, obviously Will Still was someone who was heavily linked. Dwight's come through with this comment and says, do you think if they go for Still in the summer, they won't invest as much in the squad? Just on that, I mean, before we get into it, I just think it's interesting, isn't it, this Will Still dynamic? Because if you look at the previous managers that Sunderland have appointed, they haven't necessarily been from Europe. So this sort of, thinking that they'll go for a European coach, expansive in thinking, we haven't actually seen that yet with the different appointments that we've had. We've had Lee Johnson, Alex Neil, Tony Mowbray. So it would be a different approach.
Yeah, it would. And it's felt like an approach that would fit an awful lot of what Sunderland are trying to do, hasn't it? I mean, I think Dwight probably makes a decent point, because I think a lot of it is money. There was interest in Will Still. There was interest in another couple of managers overseas, but the money didn't work. Now, clearly, there is a financial cost to getting rid of Tony Mowbray, appointing Michael Beale, and then getting rid of Michael Beale 2 months later. I guess one thing you would say is he hasn't come in with a whole host of backroom staff, so it's really just Beale we're talking about. But there's still clearly a compensation there, and then you're potentially having to pay to get a manager out of somewhere if that's the direction you want to go down. So I think it will have an impact in terms of what Sunderland are able to do in the summer. Yes. Now, the caveat to that is, if you sell Jack Clark for the kind of money that Sunderland potentially sell Jack Clark for, then your ability to do what you want to do in the transfer market is clearly transformed at a stroke. You've got to replace the best player in your team, don't get me wrong. But, if we're realistic, there has to be a decent chance that if Sunderland don't get promoted this season, Jack Clark goes to play in the Premier League next year. That then transforms what Sunderland are able to do. So I don't think it's a case of that Sunderland will not be in a position to be able to pay compensation in the summer, because, like I say, you're potentially in a very different situation come the summer, but it will be an impact. Now, going back to the Mike Dodds, we'll probably get a decent indication in the next few hours of what Sunderland are going to be doing, but I would have thought Dodds to the end of the season makes a lot of sense in so many different ways. Firstly, because this squad now has had so much upheaval in the last few weeks and months that in some ways, surely the last thing you need at this stage is someone else coming through the door with completely their own ideas and their own, who they want to play, who they don't want to play. How, at least with Dodds, he's got an immediate handle on the squad. The players clearly like him and trust him from what happened in his last caretaker spell. So that's a big tick in the box straight away. And then if you give him it to the end of the season, it then buys you that couple of months to A, have a proper strategic look at what you want to do, and B, by the end of the season, you're potentially then able to get a completely different pool of coaches than you'd be able to bring in now. So for me, it makes an awful lot of sense, especially because Dodds has proved that he can do the job.
Yeah, I'm just going to play devil's advocate here, so bear with me. But the one side to Dodds that we saw from his recent, obviously, stint as caretaker was he really wanted that time off. It seemed to really exhaust him a bit after those couple of games. Now, I don't know whether that was just because of how hectic the period was that he was in charge. I don't know what you think. Joe, that's not me saying I don't think he's ready. That's just playing devil's advocate, because obviously the results that they've got were good results. That win over Leeds, win over West Brom, 2 good results.
Yeah, you're right. But that is also something that the club will have had to have decided on before we're reaching the point that we're at, where both they're going to part ways, it seems. Yeah. If they don't have someone to bring in immediately, then the conversation has to have been had with Mike Dodds in terms of if that's the way they're going to go for an interim period. Otherwise, then you kind of scattergun again, aren't you? But I agree with Scott. It makes sense, because at this moment in time, you kind of need a little bit of all hands on deck, because it's been so sporadic basically throughout the season, to be honest. I know Tony Mowbray started it, but you can go back to the playoff semi-final last year with the links with Francisco Fariola. They came out of nowhere, really, didn't they? And that sort of caused a little bit of unrest, certainly with Mowbray. And then, is he going to go? Isn't he going to go? They then committed to Tony Mowbray. Is that something that they should have just stood firm on and gone with him last summer? Or, all these things are probably playing on in the background to where we've got to this point now where, like we're saying, this has just obviously been they admitting an error in judgment.
Yeah, and then just obviously to round things up, we'll just bring it back to obviously that article in the Financial Times yesterday by Kirill, who once again stressed the need for promotion. So as we've touched on here, that Lee Johnson sacking that was documented in the Netflix Sunderland Till I Die, Kirill explains that he felt like they weren't going to win promotion. It feels very similar here.
It does, and again, I don't want to keep banging the drum, I guess, but that kind of brings you back to, well, are they running the club to give whoever is the head coach the best chance of winning promotion every season that they're in charge of? And that, that then brings us back to recruitment. It brings us back to what type of players it's like. It's all kind of rounds up into one, doesn't it? But I mean, yeah, what this shows is there is still a determination at board level to win promotion this season. That's why you get rid of Michael Beale. Now, we can argue till the cows come home whether that's possible and whether they're set up to do that, etc., and all the things we've talked about. But whatever happens next, whether it is the appointment of a new boss or whether it is Mike Dodds till the end of the season, whoever is in that hot seat is clearly going to be charged with, you need to get us in the playoffs in these remaining 13 matches. Well, for all the reasons we've talked about, that's going to be a real battle. To then win the playoffs on the back of that is going to be an even bigger battle, given that you're going to be coming up against at least one of Leeds or Southampton, an Ipswich who are kind of rediscovering the form, etc., etc. So, yeah, an awful lot on the plate of whoever comes in next. But what you would see is, you are taking over a side that at various stages of this season has shown that it is more than capable of winning football matches in the Championship and putting together a winning run. So I don't think it's a case of everything's completely lost. I do think it's a case of this has been a really, really bad 2 months for the power brokers at Sunderland for a whole host of different reasons.
Yeah, just completely agree. Alex Neil, they need a sort of repeat of that run, don't they? What's he doing? Does anybody know? No, jokes aside, they are in a really critical period now for the rest of the season. I mean, thanks to those who've joined us so far. I mean, it's, as you know, We Are Sunderland's now live. It's 6 months of subscription for just £1. If you enter that and subscribe, you can win a signed shirt from the 2021 Papa John's Trophy Final. So head over there, subscribe. Just before we head off, obviously, we're expecting an announcement later today. Joe, what would you like to see happen next?
I think there's just got to be some clarity, doesn't there? There's got to be some acceptance that this has been the wrong decision and some guidance on where the club are going to go next, because it feels very fragile at the moment. You can look at playing staff, you can look at the sort of managerial roles, finances, whatever you want to look at. Ultimately, there needs to be a little bit of guidance on what is coming, and not necessarily aspirations in terms of saying we're going to do this in terms of reaching promotion, but this is our next step for the next 13 games. I think they have to kind of block it off in that way at the minute. If it is Dodds, you come out and say it's Dodds right now until the end of the season, and then we'll refresh then. Don't kind of let it just linger on as though there might be an appointment between now and the end of the season. Set that stall out, and then it's got to be a case of trying to, like I said before, get all hands on deck. And you don't want to, I'm not going to say salvage a season because it's not lost, like what Scott said. I mean, there's 4 points adrift, and I think we've all sort of said collectively it does feel as though it might be a struggle for them to reach the playoffs, but they are still in that conversation until they're not. You know what I mean? So these next 5 games are crucial, and then you get to the international break where everyone can kind of have a bit of a reset as well. But it's important that you try and get some sort of form. They're at home at the weekend. It's going to be really interesting to see sort of what the reaction to that's been, because the last couple of home games we've seen sort of banners unfurled as well, haven't we? So there's clearly been a bit of discontent or certainly frustrations that are getting aired over the course of the last 2 months. And that is ultimately down to the decision makers at the club getting things what supporters feel are wrong. And obviously with Beale, like we think is going to leave, just backing that up as well.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks very much for joining us. We've been We Are Sunderland in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians in Durham. Be sure to check out We Are Sunderland throughout the rest of the evening, and then tomorrow, as we look to move this on a bit further, we'll have all the latest news as and when it happens. Thanks for joining me, fellas.
Thank you.
Cheers.